So it's my pleasure to introduce three guys. Let me give just a quick recap of each one of them. So Lenny Kama is not only the CEO, but he's the chairman of the board of Jack in the Box. And if you don't know, Jack in the Box operates or franchises more than 2,200 Jack in the Box restaurants in 21 states, including Guam, and then more than 600 Qdoba Mexican grill restaurants in 47 states, including DC and Canada. So they have quite a wide variety of restaurants out there. Lenny's been with the company since 2001 and has been CEO for some time now. Lenny also serves on the board of Jack in the Box Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses the company's charitable donations to make a difference in communities where employees and franchisees and guests of Jack in the Box restaurants work and live. He's going to be accompanied by Jerry Rebel. Jerry's the EVP and the CFO of the organization. He's been there since 2008. Jerry actually serves on the board of the San Diego Chamber of Commerce and is currently its chairman, amongst a few other things. And then I already mentioned Mark Blankenship. So Mark is the Chief People, Culture, and Corporate Strategy Officer, which is a title that I actually have not seen anywhere else, but it's interesting to take a look at Mark's responsibility, because in addition to having sort of the normal head of HR responsibilities, he also oversees consumer intelligence and analytics, internal brand communications, and the corporate strategy process. So let's have a big round of applause for these folks from Jack in the Box, and I'll have them come up on stage now. Thanks, Lenny. Thanks, Jerry.
Is the clicker up there?
The clicker's right on the, yep, right there.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lenny Kama. So I want to start off by saying that what's most important that we talk about today is how we do things versus what we do. So I'm only going to take a little bit of time to talk about what we do and sort of who we are as a company, and then I will get into really how we do things, because I think there's an interesting dynamic. There's a tension that exists, and it's a good tension if you set things up properly as a company and I think as a CEO. So first, let me address who we are. So Jack in the Box, founded in 1951, we're this quirky brand. We are really sarcastic, and we have funny commercials, and we cut through all the noise that allows this somewhat regional brand to compete against some of the bigger brands that are out there. As stated earlier, we have just over 2,200 restaurants in 21 states and now Guam, and we are 82% franchised, and recently communicated that we're going to move up to at least 90% franchised. Qdoba, which joined us about 11 or so years ago, had 86 restaurants at the time. It was founded in 1995. It's the second largest fast casual Mexican brand out there, and we are 51% franchised. And the reason for pointing out the franchise mix for both brands is that it becomes important when I talk about stakeholders in just a moment. So what have we done through the lens of performance? Well, this chart, you don't have to be a financial analyst to understand the chart, but essentially this is talking about total shareholder return, which is one way to value what we've been able to achieve in the last 11 years. And when you look at the blue line, that's the S&P 500. When you look at the black line, that's our peer group. And you look at the red line, that's Jack in the Box. Over the last 11 years, we have added a lot of shareholder value with the things that we've done. And this is important, but it didn't happen magically by waving a wand. I think it happened because of some of the how-tos that I'll discuss with you here, and so will Jerry and Mark. But the interesting thing about what happens, whether it be with the street or the shareholder or any of the other stakeholders that we'll discuss, there's this tension that exists around what have you done for me lately? Because at the end of the day, no matter who the stakeholder is, they continue to want more and more. And the stakeholder idea is really where I started as a CEO in laying a foundation for how I wanted to see things done. So I identified, with the help of my colleagues, who the key stakeholders are. Now, this doesn't mean these are the only stakeholders, but it's the ones that we're going to focus on when we make decisions. And essentially what I said was, what is it that these people want? Let's think about that. So think about the guest. We've got guests out there who say, we want incredible, juicy hamburgers and huge, decadent burritos. And then we have other consumers out there, some who may be coming to our brand, some not, who are saying, we want GMO-free foods. We want hormone-free chicken. Others say, I want a great dining experience, and others say, I want to fly through the drive-thru. At the end of the day, that guest that we are targeting is a stakeholder, and they have desires. And those desires don't always align to the other stakeholders. For example, how many people believe that the guests would like to get everything on our menu cheaper? Exactly. But what do you think the shareholders would think about that if we said we're just going to cut all the prices and let the guests have the food almost for free? Do you think they'd be happy? No. So we have to pay attention to what the guest wants, and they want a whole lot of things, and sometimes they're not even quite sure why they want those things. For example, how many people know the scientific definition of GMO-free foods? It's just like describing from Volkswagen back in the day, what is Farfignugan? I don't know, but I want it. And back in the day, there was Chevron, a Chevron with Techron. Anybody know what Techron is? But I want it. And so this is the type of thing that we deal with these stakeholders. Well, what about the employees? Well, we all know employees, they're going to do the whole equity comparison. Why do they get more training dollars than we get? And how come they have better car benefits than we do? And why are they flying first class and I'm going back to coach? At the end of the day, the employee is always thinking about what they should get and oftentimes comparing it to what other employees are getting. Well, how do you keep those people aligned and engaged going forward? That's a huge stakeholder. They're the ones who drive the business. And then who are our owners? Our owners are those franchisees, the 82% franchise Jack in the Box and the 51% franchise Qdoba. When you have a big franchise base like we do, they become instrumental and very influential in all decisions that you make. So ultimately, these people deserve a seat at the table. And not just a seat at the table that you sort of pacify them and say, well, let's make them feel like they're part of the decision. We know how that works, right? Some executives do that too. Let's make you feel like you're part of the decision, but they walk into the room knowing what they want to do. If you do that with your owners, they'll eat you alive. There's no way they're going to stand for that. And then what about the shareholder? Most people think, especially the perception is of most people that would be in this room, is that you would believe that the shareholder is just all about money, 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 money. It's really not true. There are long-term shareholders and there are short-term shareholders. The longer-term shareholders typically take a vested interest in your business, try to learn a lot about your business, try to get a lot of face time with your executives so that they can kind of move in lockstep with you in understanding how long they should hold on to your stock. But they're not moving in and out of your stock on a quarterly basis. And then there are those short-term folks. And they are kind of just about money because they're trying to just predict what's going to happen with your company that's going to impact you in the short term so they can bet on you or against you. And so you have to keep those folks happy, and they're not all created equal. So essentially, when I came into the position, we worked on defining who these stakeholders should be. And then we said, well, what does that all matter? Why are you talking about this? And the reason is we want to make decisions that will positively impact all four stakeholders. And it's really difficult to do, but it's really important if you want to align all of the folks who represent these stakeholders within your business. As you could guess, someone in Jerry's position might represent the shareholders more so than the employees, and someone in Mark's position might represent the employees more so than the guests, but someone in marketing might represent the guest more so than ops, who might represent the owners. All of those folks come with a perspective, and those perspectives can sometimes be very one-sided. How many people have kids? All right, so has your kid ever come home and said, this is what I learned from a friend, and it shocked you? And you thought, let me correct this. This is what you should know. How many people have had to do that? Well, stakeholders are kind of like that. They show up with their perspective. And if unchecked, if you don't say you also have to think about these other perspectives, then things can sort of run amok. And so you have to align them by saying, yeah, it's important, Mark, that you support the employee, but it's also important that you know Jerry's perspective and that you support what he's trying to get done. And that's really where it all starts. So what do all those stakeholders want in order to be passionate and excited about coming to work every day? They want something more than just burgers and burritos. And that's where purpose comes in. We could just say, look, shut up and do your job. Sell the burrito and sell the burger. How many people think that would be engaging? Not so much. So for Jack in the Box, we have a purpose. We just launched this purpose within the last 6 months, and it's really to nourish the pursuit of dreams. Now, what does that mean? That means we're going to invest in you as an employee. We're going to invest in you as a franchisee. We're going to keep you well informed as a shareholder and allow your opinions to be at the table, right? And at the end of the day, we're going to try to do all those things to your professional and personal benefit, but what we want from you is that you're going to give your best effort at work to the company's benefit. And so ultimately what we try to do is give people some way to engage deeper than just what we sell every day, a way for them to connect emotionally. Because what we found is when people engage at a deeper level, our company will perform better. And this is a chart by the Stengel 50, which essentially says companies that have purpose outperform companies that don't. So if you look at the yellow chart, that's representing the 50 companies that were analyzed within the S&P 500 that are purpose-driven companies as compared to the general S&P 500. And essentially what they found was those companies that had engaged employees at a deeper level performed better. And that's something that we would like to do as an organization. We're at the very beginning stages of that. So you get to this place where you say, as CEO, I have outlined the stakeholders, and I've required everybody to think on behalf of all of the stakeholders to try to make decisions that benefit all four. And in addition to that, we want employees, we want franchisees, we want guests, we want shareholders to understand that we're a purpose-driven company so they engage deeper in what it is that we're going to do. And that all sounds great. And then reality sets in, and the reality is that these are the things that recenter us when we go off-center. These are the things that keep us grounded and give us a foundation. But on a daily basis, it's like herding cats. Because ultimately, people still come into the room primarily with the perspective of that particular stakeholder. And so we've created a couple of videos for you that bring to life this dynamic, this healthy tension, but very real tension that exists. And we focused on the CHRO position and the CFO position and the realities of what it's like to try to find a way to meet in the middle toward the common good for all the stakeholders. So with that, why don't we roll the first video?
So Jerry, listen, I know that you've been kept up to speed on the web-based training project. We've been pretty excited about it, but we've been unsure about the test. So we're at a point now where we're feeling pretty good about the results that we're starting to see. So I want to talk to you about this capital project.
Geez, I wonder what this is going to cost. Is there any real return here? I'm not seeing it.
We think we're ready to put this in the system.
I haven't beat the solitaire game in a week.
Understand how it works. We've got the price down to about $600 a unit. So we're thinking this is going to be about a $1.8 to $2 million capital project.
I don't think we have any budget for this. Typical Blankenship. I hope this is quick. I got lunch today. My wife is going to meet me for lunch. I haven't done that in a while. Yeah, I hope it doesn't take all day too, because I have cocktails at 3 today.
So interesting video. So I'll tell you, we have one more to show you, but I will tell you, these guys were asked, how many takes did you have to go through before you nailed that video? One. It took them literally 5 minutes in each of their offices because that's the natural outcome of their meetings. So let's yeah, this was not acting. So let's roll the second video and see the opposite side of this.
I have great news. We're going to kick off the G&A budgeting cycle again that year. I know this is always a good time for all of us.
Oh, great. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Number of the strategic initiatives.
Wow. This is going to be another big headcount reduction. You can see this one coming a mile away.
Talk about some of the things that we're not going to do so that we can afford to pay for the new initiatives.
Does this guy not understand that we need to get stuff done and we can't do it with fewer people?
So we're going to have to have some conversations.
Wow. This is going to be a tough message for HR to communicate to the organization.
Pressure from the street. Pressure from our shareholders and the board on getting our G&A costs a little lower than what they have been.
You know, it always seems to be about the shareholders. He never talks about employees first or guests first. It's always about the shareholders and our board. I hope you can hurry up and finish so I can go get my lunch run in. Need to blow off some steam after listening to this crap.
Let's give it up for the actors. So before I ask Jerry to come up and share with you, I will say that what they did was sort of poking fun at that sort of healthy tension, but that tension does exist, and I think what you really have to do as an organization and as leaders, find a way to sort of ground yourself around a common set or a common understanding around how you want to make decisions. And the stakeholder piece of it and the purpose piece of it is the way that we've sort of set about this. So with that, I'd ask Jerry to come up and share with you.
Hey, good morning. The videos were a lot of fun to do, and they didn't take that long, obviously, but we do a number of things in the organization that help us to not have those kind of conversations. So Lenny mentioned the 4 stakeholder groups, which I think is critical for us to align across the core leadership team as well as throughout the organization about how we make strategic decisions and then how we even make day-to-day decisions. So, and we have those conversations and use those 4 stakeholder groups when we're talking with our franchise owners, but we also talk to our shareholders about that. So we'll talk about the importance that we have to ensure that our franchisees are profitable. So it's not just all about the shareholder return. In order to get a long-term shareholder return, we have to have a profitable set of franchise owners to be able to invest in the business going forward and to generate growth. So we're perfectly happy to communicate how we feel about those 4 stakeholder groups across the organization. We also use the STAR model here and as the other foundational piece that we have to ground us in conversation that is a bit more productive and perhaps a little less territorial than what you saw on the videos. And Mark's been teaching the STAR model into the organization for the last 3 or so plus years, and he's been very methodical and determined to make sure that he teaches that in. And Mark will get up and draw this model on the whiteboard, such that even on the dry erase whiteboard, I think it's permanently in there because he draws it so much. But this is something that I think is really helpful for us to have productive conversations and to make good business decisions. And for me to understand where Mark's coming from for the people organization, we'd actually have a better conversation about the training module that Mark was talking about than what we showed. But Mark also understands that it's important for the shareholders to get a return. And it's important for investments that we're expecting our franchisees to also get a return on that investment. So I think we use those 2 pieces pretty well to help ground the organization, certainly unify the leadership team. Now, we're not the only ones who are looking for that kind of interaction. What we've seen here is, if you look over time, investors generally made investment decisions and therefore place a valuation on the company from their perspective based upon historical financial performance or the tangible numbers. More recently, and I'd say over the last 15 years or so, we've seen that while investors still value that historical financial performance, they also want to understand some of the intangibles, meaning some things that are a little less easy to measure. So they want to understand what is the strategy of the organization. And more importantly, is it believable? They also want to be able to meet with management, look us in the eyes, and determine, are we credible? Do we have the competence to be able to deliver on that strategy? Because the strategy execution is key. And are we trustworthy? And are we going to be transparent with our communications with the street in terms of what's working well and what's not working well? And if you look at what Lenny and I and also Mark have, what we deal with now when we are out talking to the street, talking with potential shareholders and shareholders, we've seen this trend really accelerate over the last 5 years, where most of our investors are institutional funds, and their corporate governance practices will not allow them to take a significant investment in any given company without first sitting down and having that conversation with management. So we're seeing this both internally and externally. Now, the interesting thing is, as the street is focused on strategic execution, there's a fairly recent booze and company. That's a great name for a company, by the way, booze. Anyway, there's a fairly recent booze and company study that identifies, that looked at a lot of global executives. And it was surprising to me to find out that about 60% of those surveyed did not have a great deal of confidence in the ability of their organization to execute on their strategy. It was surprising to me from a couple of perspectives. One, that that large of a number of executives in a company would doubt their strategy and their ability to execute on it. And secondly, that they would admit that. But when you look at it, you had more than 2/3 of the respondents indicate that their organizations had too many priorities. Anybody here have that same problem? I know we do. They also said, more than half of them said two things, that they had difficulty in allocating resources across those priorities, and they had significant doubt about their ability to execute on the strategy, given the high level of priorities that they had, and given their inability to allocate those scarce resources to those few priorities. Now, at Jack in the Box, we certainly suffer from at least the too many priority piece, and we're working very hard, utilizing the stakeholder group and the STAR model, as well as our strategic plan to focus our organization on the right number of priorities and the right priorities. Now, the good news is the leadership team completely and fully buys into this, in theory, until they find out that their priority doesn't make the high list priority. So we're working through those issues today, but I think these are issues that every company has to work through, but you have to be able to have some degree of focus to be able to allocate the resources on the right items, get those finished, and then move on to the next ones. And so we're working on that very hard, but we're not there yet. On the i4cp research that was done in 2015, identified 4 key best practices that corporations, when corporations do well on executing strategy, what do they do? One is they have to have very visible buy-in from the organization at the leadership level of that corporate strategy. So they have to have it not just from the CEO, but the CEO, the CFO, the CHRO, the chief legal officer, and the brand presidents all have to be well aligned with what that corporate strategy is and how you're going to go about executing it. The second thing is you need to be able to communicate and be willing to communicate that strategy across the entire organization to all employees. And once is not enough. You have to do it regularly. Twice is not enough. You have to keep communicating that on a regular basis to all of your employees. Then the other thing was get this common enemy and align around that. But it's important to align around that common enemy without creating a fear culture in the organization. There's a fine line there. You have to walk that pretty well. The other thing, though, was to be able to communicate and stress the importance of the strategic execution to all your employees. And you can best do that if you can align the employee goals around that strategic execution. Nothing says that leadership is bought into the strategy, more like tying it to a goal. So if every employee can look at a goal that they have for their annual review process and tie it into a strategic initiative that's going to drive the strategy, that's what good looks like. And so those 4 elements, I think, are spot on, and we are working pretty well on most of those, but we have some work to do on a few. And then this one here is done by E&Y, this study, and what they found is that high-performing organizations, which they determined to be companies that have EBITDA growth of greater than 10% a year, that there tends to be a greater collaboration between the CFO and the CHRO. Now, on those high-performing companies, what they found was that 80% of the respondents said that the CFO and the CHRO are spending more time together over the last 3 years and are becoming better business partners. They also determined that what helps in that regard is that they spend more time together, which I think is pretty obvious. The other thing, though, which I think is equally important, is that they are considered to be peers in the organization. Mark and I each have that EVP in front of whatever it is that we do, which tells everybody that we're on the exact same level. I think that's extraordinarily important here. The other thing is that both collaborate and participate in the construct of the strategic plan. And I think Mark and I, certainly over the last 3 years, and perhaps more so, have partnered much more effectively than what we perhaps have in the past. I'd say Mark and I and Mark's predecessor and I, we worked well together when we needed to. But that's different than being a partner and collaboration and being a business partner with your peer. And I think that's where Mark and I are today, and we work pretty hard on that, and it's certainly paid off for us. And then this is interesting here. I think it's great to have the studies and the research. It's great to have the models, and it's great to have a strategic plan. And it's great to have the goals all well aligned and communicated effectively. But real world gets in the way. And this is our learning map for the Jack in the Box brand that we use for training out in the field and others. And I love the map because it's chaotic. And I would suspect if everybody did a learning map similar to this, your organization would look very similar. But all these little vignettes in here are all about conflict that get in the way of executing that strategic strategy. And so that conflict is both internal and external. So you have misalignment between departments within an organization. You have misalignment perhaps between the two brands that we operate. Hopefully we don't have misalignment between leadership, but you can have misalignment between leadership. And then also external factors crop in, the economy, or the regulatory environment, what's going on there, what kind of changes might you need to make. What are the competitors doing? Today, the fast food segment is very value-oriented discounting. So how do you respond to that? And also, what are your shareholders demanding out of you today that may not be perfectly well aligned with your long-term strategy? And through the use of those 4 stakeholder groups and the STAR model and the leadership partnership that we have across our organization, we're able to do the necessary pivots that we need to do from time to time to meet some of these short-term demands and short-term needs, but at the same time not losing focus on the long-term strategy. But that requires a lot of discipline on the leadership part, a lot of communication on the leadership, both between ourselves as well as throughout the organization. And it really requires a significant amount of partnership across all leaders, but particularly between the CFO and the CHRO. And again, Mark and I have worked very hard on that partnership, and I'm very pleased and proud of where it is today. I'm going to turn this over to Mark now, and he's going to bring us home.
All right, thanks, Jerry.
Well done. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I learned as we were putting this together was I always thought when I was talking to Jerry that, he was working on his calculator, doing ROI calculations, so to find out that he was playing solitaire really was an insult. Now I realize that this cartoon, I'm sure, doesn't represent any of your organizations. I shared this recently as I was presenting at a conference to our franchisees, and I was talking to them about the relationship that they have with the brand and that the brand has with them. And I think, it speaks to, again, strategic alignment. So not only strategic alignment at the top of the house of the organization, but strategic alignment with the stakeholders, in this case, our owners, right? So when you run a brand that is basically controlled by other people, right, you need them to buy into what you're doing because you can't tell them what to do on most things, right? But oftentimes what happens in our organizations is exactly this when we're not aligned, right? Some of us will feel like, hey, as long as I'm doing better than you, things are okay, right? So franchisees may say, hey, our restaurants are performing better than your restaurants. Sure glad, we're doing okay. The challenge is that we have to realize at the end of the day, all the stakeholders are in it together. This is not a win-win proposition. And, Lenny mentioned that, and Jerry supported, but we burned in kind of the STAR model as a framework for how we think about things because it allows us to go to a common place in which we all agree, and then we can tackle the difficult questions in that regard. Well, another one that we apply was developed by Connors and Smith, and if you've read their work on Change the Culture, Change the Game, it speaks to very important things about human behavior, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar, it starts with the experiences that we have with one another, right? Experiences that we have as individuals, experiences that we have with our organization. Those experiences translate into a belief system. And we take that belief system with us. That belief system then translates into how we behave, right? And that may or may not align with the stated objectives of the organization. So all of our organizations have mission, vision, values. They're plastered everywhere, right? That's what we espouse. But are the governing values, right, do they align with the espoused values? That all comes down to the experiences that people have. So if the experiences people have in your business align with what you espouse, you really don't have an issue. But it's when you have experiences that don't quite align, your belief systems start to form differently. And that's what causes us to behave in ways that create misalignment. Misalignment around strategic execution, in this case specifically. And then, of course, the results you get aren't the results you expected. And then you look back and you wonder why. Like, we had this great plan, we had this great strategy, we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve. Why is that? And there are some fundamental things about us as human beings. And it's that, right, when we think about ourselves, we tend to judge ourselves by our intentions, while at the same time, we tend to judge others by their actions. And why is that? It's because I know what my intent is, right? How often have you said something to someone and they're like, well, is this what you mean? And you're like, no, I didn't mean that. That's actually not what I meant. That wasn't my intention. But we don't do that oftentimes. We don't probe at that level oftentimes with others. We just see how they behave. And then we assign intent to the behavior. And the challenge with that is that once you become suspicious of someone's intention, right? Once you become suspicious of their motive, everything slows down because now the relationship is not based on trust, right? So if Jerry doesn't trust me for whatever reason, because he thinks my intent is just to do stuff that really doesn't have a return, right? And not everything has a measurable return. I think you have to admit that to begin with too. It slows things down, right? Our organization is going to be less agile because now there's going to be more meetings and more questions and more data, because you're going to have to prove to me until I understand what your intent is. So it really takes committed work, right, on an individual relationship basis to be willing to have a conversation with someone that sometimes is uncomfortable. And sometimes means you need to let your ego kind of go. It means I need to be willing to walk into Jerry's office and say, you know, Jerry, I've got this program I want to roll. And I think it's got some savings associated with it, but I'm not quite so sure because the savings are in time. I mean, oftentimes HR people, what their programs save is time, right? And they walk into their CFO's office and say, hey, I'm going to save 40 hours a week of manager's time. So the payback on this is huge. You take their salary, you multiply it by the time, and it pays back. And the CFO looks at you and says, I'm not saving anything, right? The CFO's position is, show me where I can erase some money out of the budget. That's savings, right? So you'd be better off approaching the conversation by saying, look, we're saving time, and here's how we're going to reallocate it. And we think this is a more productive use of time. We think this is what we might get for it. But it's a mistake for me to misjudge the time savings as true savings. But unless I'm willing to have a conversation with Jerry about that and say, you know, for as uncomfortable as it might be, this is your space, not mine. Can you educate me? Can you help me, right? I think that instills actually a little bit of confidence from Jerry to me, knowing that I'm willing to kind of let myself be a little bit vulnerable in that conversation. But at the end of the day, right, it's trust is what you need. It's what Lenny spoke to. If you're truly going to be able to work the organization, especially, right, it's easy to do when the organization is performing well. You can ignore a lot of your warts when things are working well, but it's when things get tough, and they will get tough at some point, and you need to lean on one another, right, and you need your team to support you in the things that you're doing, those relationships have to be baked on trust. And so if we shift gears for just a second, you say, okay, we get all that, right? It takes work to build relationships based on trust. It takes work to drive strategic alignment from the top of the organization to the bottom of the organization, because if there's just a little bit of separation at the top, by the time you get to the point of execution, there's a lot of separation. And for us, that happens in our restaurants. So it's really important that the frontline employee, where the moment of truth happens, where they touch our guests, they need to understand what is the strategic intent. Maybe not in the language that we use it, but in a way that works for them. And so it's important for us to know, like, well, how do you know? How do you know if they know? Now you could say, well, just look at the sales. If sales go up, then they must understand the strategic intent. I would argue that that's, a superficial analysis of it. So we actually have a framework that we use to measure the degree to which our employees understand our strategic intent. It's called ACE, Alignment, Capabilities, and Engagement. It's developed by the Metris Group. And it speaks very specifically to the alignment piece or the head piece. Do employees understand what their job is, what the consumer actually expects of our brand when they come to our brand? How does their job connect to goals at the restaurant? How do the goals of the restaurant connect to the goals of their district? How do the goals of the district connect to the goals of the company? People want to be something bigger, part of something bigger than themselves. That's the alignment piece. It's very intellectual. What's my job? What are my goals? How does it connect to something bigger than me? The head. The second piece is capabilities. So if that's what you want me to do, then do you provide me with the right tools, the right equipment, the right information, the right team, right? And nothing frustrates employees more than being surrounded by the wrong team, because employees want to win too. So they want and need all of those things. That's the hands piece. It's what you want me to do. I need the things to do what you want me to do. And the last piece is engagement, or the heart. Are you actually emotionally connecting to employees? Do they feel like you care about them? So we measure that. And the reason we measure that is because it's a way where the three of us can completely agree on the business. So we understand, right, that restaurants that are high in alignment, capabilities, and engagement versus those that are not outperform the low restaurants in anything we measure. So for example, restaurants that are high in ACE have 21% less turnover. They have 2.3% more productivity. And this is, for us, this may seem like a small number, but this is labor as a percentage of sales. 2.3% of labor as a percentage of sales of $1.5 million. You start doing the math on a per copy basis, it's a lot of money, right? So it's important for those of us who sit in the people organization to understand what data we have at our fingertips to help the rest of the organization that tends to be a little bit more quantitative feel like the stuff we're doing actually is resulting in performance, in better execution. And this is data that all of us have, right? This stuff is not rocket science, right? And at the end of the day, the bottom line is those restaurants that are high in ACE, on average, experience 10% higher sales and 30% higher profit. So when I'm always talking to our franchise owners, I said, hey, look, if I told you you could put a piece of equipment in your restaurant that would boost your profits by 30%, would you do it? And of course, they all say, absolutely. What is it? Where can I buy it? And I say, it's your people. Because it all comes back, we're in the people business. It all comes back to the leader, having the right team is what drives the business. And this is how we understand, right, how our behaviors at the top, the good, the bad, and the ugly, for as hard as we work on being aligned, right, and we recognize that we're not that way all the time, this is where the rubber meets the road. And this is the impact that we have on our business. So it's super important regardless, right, of kind of the paradoxes that we have to manage and the uncomfortable conversations that we have to have. This is the real meaning and the real value of us working together at the end of the day, because this benefits all stakeholders. Everybody wins here. There are no losers in this equation. So it's important to have that measurement foundation in what you're doing in your businesses. So I'm going to end with that. I think we have maybe a little bit of time for Q&A, Kevin. So we'll open it up to the audience. Silence fell over the crowd.
One over there, Mark.
Up. Yep. Question?
Hi, good morning. So I'm really interested in how you got buy-in. I'm assuming that you brought in the STAR model. 2 questions for that. What made you choose that particular model, and how did you get buy-in for your leadership team to actually use it?
Yeah, good question. So, first of all, just kind of, I'm a guy who's into simple things, right? I mean, come on now, I'm in the burger and fry and burrito business. So, it's got to be simple. There's lots of models and lots of frameworks, and I would say pick one that works for you and your organization. What I love about Jay Galbraith's model is it's so simple, right? You can just put it up there, you talk about it one time, and people get it. So it has just become part of who we are. So I love it. Yeah, there are things, and there are more details to it, but when you can just say the STAR model and people know exactly what you're talking about, and you can say, let's talk about, if you want to change the structure, how does that affect the talent? People get the connections there. They get all the intended and unintended consequences. So I just happen to like Jay's work. I think he had a lot of impact on the field. I think we all miss him because I think he still would have had great things to do. So that's how we ended up with it. And it just, as Jerry said, the first time you put it up there, people are like, oh my God, here's another HR model, right? But I think it makes sense. And so over time, you just have to socialize it, and eventually the organization comes to accept it.
I was trying to imagine my own executives doing that video, let alone in one take. So hats off to you, gentlemen. From an organizational talent or talent development perspective, and maybe recognizing you are sort of unique individuals, do you build in this collaboration in the pipeline in any special ways in terms of having people move across the functions? Do you try to do that deliberately or just let nature take its course there in terms of how people rise to the top with the capabilities that you have?
Yeah, so we actually are very deliberate about it. So we have marketing people who have gone on to be vice presidents of operations. We have HR folks who are currently regional franchise directors. We have individuals in the finance group who have gone out to run operating divisions. And we very deliberately will look at the high potential people and how we can expose them to the other functions at the right stage in their career where they can get the support to be successful in those positions, but primarily so that they learn about that other stakeholder's perspective, so that when they land in a CMO seat or a president seat or whatever seat it is that has a lot of influence, they can do that with a much broader perspective on the business than just the functional one that maybe they traditionally would have come up in. Got a question up front here? Okay.
Hi, thanks. You mentioned that sometimes you have to have the uncomfortable conversation. I was just curious to know if you put in place any specific tactics to create a culture where that happens.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of it. We put into place.
If you put in place any specific tactics to create a culture where it's comfortable to have the uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if it's ever comfortable, to be honest with you, but we put a lot of time into understanding our dynamics. So it started with, the foundation was norms. So what norms are we going to have, right, to have a conversation? What's in bounds, what's out of bounds? We took time to give each other pretty detailed feedback. And it's probably for some of the team members, it was the first time they heard some of those things, and we had to process that and figure out what we were all about as a team. And then it just takes constant work. So you have to play within the norms that you set for yourselves, and you have to be able to call yourselves when you're not following your norms, right? But what makes it easier is the frequency. So when Jerry says we spend more time together, in the last 3 years, we've probably spent more time together than we did in the previous 8 years. It makes it so much easier for us to have a conversation. And it's much more comfortable to come in and say, help me understand where you were coming from. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with, what we talked about. And then what you find is that those one-on-one conversations start to translate into the group conversations. So when Lenny has a staff meeting, that stuff just comes out on the table now, and it just becomes much more comfortable because it becomes the norm over time. It takes work.
I would say one very practical thing that happens now as compared to how we worked together in the past is that, Mark mentioned we judge other people's actions, but we tend to only judge our own intentions. So a normal thing that happens in a meeting environment today or one-on-one is that rather than coming into the conversation arguing your position to start, you come into the conversation stating your intentions. And I think that sets the stage for the uncomfortable conversation. If you can create that type of norm, it's a lot easier for people to respect where you're coming from.
And just the fact that Mark and I spend a lot more time together, it builds a relationship, and that relationship builds trust. And I don't think you can have those direct, uncomfortable conversations unless you have trust first. And
One more question.
Hi. I'm just curious, you mentioned that you measure engagement, and I was curious to know how you measure it, so it's kind of a two-part question, how you measure the engagement, and as well as when you think about millennials, how do you keep them engaged, and do you measure that differently?
Yes, so we do, as I mentioned, we have this ACE survey. It's conducted by an external organization. We've done it now for 15 years. I can tell you that the data are incredibly consistent over time. So the magnitude of correlations and things like that may go up and down a little bit within the margin of error. The data are very consistent. So we understand the finer details of alignment, capabilities, and engagement, and how those relate to our actual business performance. Now, you spoke to generational differences, so we've been able to slice and dice the data differently, and we've learned a lot along the way. So our D&I team actually was born out of results that came out of the ACE study. So one year we found out, for example, that newer employees, and for Jack in the Box at the time, newer employees were people that were there less than 5 years, felt like, hey, it's not even okay to challenge the status quo. No one's interested in listening to me or anything like that. So we actually take action on those results, and processes were put into place to address that. We have tried to separate out kind of fact and fiction when it comes to millennials, right? Because you see and hear a lot of different things. And it's not just millennials. I think every generation, when they came into the workforce, they brought change with them that the previous generation said, what? And now it's just, they're bigger. It's a much bigger group. So what they're bringing is a little bit louder. I think it's important that your organization try to understand what your employees expect from you, because again, you need to have a good marriage between your employee value proposition and your customer value proposition. And it's not it's all about the millennials and no one else. You have to make it work for everybody. I think flexibility is a big piece of it. I think if your organization is going to be flexible, right, I think you can engage millennials in a way that's pretty meaningful. There may be some things that are slightly more important to them. Lenny talked about purpose. They're willing to make trades, believe it or not. They're willing to say, it's important to me to be able to go surf at lunch. I mean, what do you care? As long as I get my work done, I'll work at 2 in the morning. But for some leaders, that's hard, right? You're not in your cubicle, so you're not working. So you have to help your leaders understand what changes make a meaningful difference for your employees.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Please join me in thanking Lenny, Jerry, and Mark. Fantastic. Great story. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Fantastic. I just love this story, and I love the the relationship that these guys have. I'm sure many of you are sitting back thinking, man, I wish I had that in my organization. And so if you want to ask them a few questions,